There is a scene in the final episode of the first season of Invincible where a father beats his son nearly unconscious across 3 continents while asking the same question over and over again. The question is about time. The question is about what a boy will have eventually when every person he has ever loved on this fragile little planet is dead, and a Viltrumite goes on living. The boy answers him from the floor of a city he has helped destroy. The answer is 2 soft words about who would still be there at the end of all that grief. It is the only answer in the fight that the father did not anticipate. It is the answer that breaks him. The show ends on a smile. The father is smiling at his son before he turns and flies upward and leaves the planet behind. He has lost the fight. He has won something else, something the show will spend 3 more seasons unfolding very slowly, very quietly, while you assume the story is about whether Mark can punch hard enough, and the theory about what is really happening underneath that smile is the theory the entire show has been hiding from you in plain sight. There are theories that exist in the plain reading of the comic, theories that live in the gap between the comic and the show, and theories that hover only in the silence between scenes. We will go through them slowly tonight. Some explain why Nolan stayed. Some explain why Cecil keeps him alive. The biggest explains where Mark is going and why the show has never really been about saving the world. It has always been about choosing to be a Viltrumite, or choosing not to. Before we go further, a quick note. If you enjoy long-form sleep essays like this one, subscribing helps the channel keep going. It costs nothing and takes about 3 seconds. Now, where were we? We were trying to understand what a Viltrumite is. And the first theory, the one that everything else in the series eventually leans against, is about a man named Nolan Grayson, who wrote children's books for a living, who walked the dog every morning, who made his wife pancakes on Saturdays for 2 decades, and who, when the order came to begin the slaughter, hesitated. The simplest version of the theory says he hesitated because he fell in love. The more honest version of the theory says he hesitated because his empire had already broken him, and he had no idea, and the love just gave the brokenness somewhere to live. You have to understand what Viltrum does to its soldiers to understand why this matters. Viltrum is not just a militarized planet. Viltrum is a culture that bred itself into a single function over the span of generations. That culled every member of its own population who could not perform that function. That constructed an entire civilization around the idea that the universe is supposed to be unified under one species and under one chain of command. The Viltrumite Empire did not become the strongest power in the galaxy because it had the strongest fighters. It became the strongest because it had the most disciplined ones. Discipline on Viltrum means the surrender of every personal trait that could interfere with conquest. It means killing the parts of yourself that flinch. It means doing the work even when the work is the worst thing you have ever done. It means being able to stand inside a room of children and continue the assignment. Nolan was given that assignment, and Nolan failed it, and the question is, why? The show wants you to believe this for a while because it is a softer answer, and because it makes the fight in Chicago hurt more if you think of him as a man who lost himself in love, and then lost the love itself. But the show also gives you a different kind of evidence, very quietly, across the first season and into the second. There is the matter of the book he was writing. There is the matter of the way he keeps a steam engine on the cover of that book, an image with no real Viltrumite reference, an image from Earth's industrial past, an image he chose because he found it beautiful. There is the matter of the way he speaks to his son when his son is small, before he ever begins to push him toward training, the way he describes the world to him as if he is genuinely curious about it. There is the matter of Debbie and the way he chose her, and the way the comic later confirms that he chose her in part because she did not see him as a god, and that mattered to him in a way he did not have the vocabulary to name. These are not the behaviors of a Viltrumite who hesitated because of one emotional accident. These are the behaviors of a Viltrumite who was already cracked before he left for Earth, who had already begun on Viltrum itself to keep small private thoughts that he could not have admitted to anyone in his squad without being executed for thought crime, who came to Earth not as a perfect soldier carrying out an order, but as a damaged man hoping, somewhere underneath the mission, that the order would fail. This is the theory that gives the smile its weight. The smile at the end of the first season is not the smile of a man who has decided to give his son a chance. It is the smile of a man who has just been told by his son that he is not alone, that when everyone else is gone, there will still be one person who remembers him. The fight stripped Nolan of every protection he had built around himself. The fight made him admit that he had built a life on a planet he was supposed to destroy, and that the life had become more real than the mission. And the answer Mark gave him on that floor was the answer he had never let himself want to hear. You can read every later choice Nolan makes through this. The voluntary exile to Thraxa, the new wife, the new son. The repeated, almost compulsive attempt to build the same family in a different place, as if he is trying to prove to himself that what happened on Earth was not a one-time mistake, but a recurring possibility. When the Viltrumites finally come for him on Thraxa, when they kill Andress's species by the hundreds, when they put him in chains and take him home for execution, he does not fight as a man who is being interrupted. He fights as a man who has been waiting for this for 2 decades, who has known the whole time that the bill would come due, and who was finally being honest about the kind of person he had been hoping he could become. The smile, then, is the moment Nolan stops lying to himself. There is a darker reading. The darker reading says Nolan stayed because Viltrumite biology demands a kind of legacy that the Empire does not officially acknowledge. That the older a Viltrumite gets, the more the constant proximity to combat and immortality erodes the social satisfaction that other beings get from less violent forms of meaning, and that a soldier nearing his 2nd century begins to need something the Empire cannot provide. The Empire provides war. It does not provide a child. And so the conquest assignments to long-lived worlds, the ones that require decades of infiltration, became a kind of unspoken hospice for warriors who needed something else before they died. Nolan, in this reading, was sent to Earth not because Earth was strategically important, but because Earth had a population genetically compatible enough to give an aging soldier a hybrid child. And the Empire had quietly figured out that warriors with hybrid children fight differently when they finally come home. Either harder, because they have something to defend, or not at all, because they have already defected. The Empire calculated that risk and decided it was acceptable. This is the theory that explains why Conquest later will not just kill Mark when given the chance. The theory that explains why Thrag will eventually become more interested in Mark's genetics than in Mark's defeat. The theory that explains why the Empire keeps coming back to this one boy on this one planet long after any reasonable conqueror would have moved on. The Empire saw, in Nolan's defection, not a tragic loss, but an unexpected outcome of an experiment they had been running for centuries. And the outcome was a child whose blood, in some way they were still learning to name, was the most valuable substance currently in the universe. You do not need to accept this reading to feel its weight. You only need to notice that Nolan, after he is taken from Thraxa, does not die. He is put in a prison. He is given time, and the time he is given is the time he uses to write to his son, in long letters that the show has not shown you in full, and may not ever show you in full, about what it means to be the kind of being that lives for 10,000 years and only chooses to love 4 or 5 times across all of it. Those letters are not a man preparing to die. Those letters are a man preparing to hand off the only thing he ever made that he was proud of. And the thing he is proud of is not a war. It is a boy who said 2 soft words from the floor of a destroyed city. So when you look at Nolan now, when you look at Omni-Man, you are not really looking at a Viltrumite. You are looking at a Viltrumite who failed the only test that matters by Viltrumite standards, and who became, by Earth standards, the only kind of Viltrumite worth being. The theory that opens every other theory in the show is the theory that Viltrum has been losing this war from the very first time one of its soldiers stayed somewhere too long. Which brings us to the boy on the floor and what he is going to become. The second theory, the one that the entire comic eventually confirms and that the show has been very quietly preparing you for since the first time you saw Mark sit on the steps of his house and complain about his powers not arriving, is that Mark is not going to spend his life as Earth's defender. Mark is going to spend his life ruling the Viltrumite Empire. Not as a conqueror, not as a tyrant, as a king who has been forced into the job by a sequence of catastrophes, none of which he initiated, and who will spend centuries trying to undo what his species spent millennia building. This is the destination. The show is structured around hiding it from you, and the show is structured around showing it to you in everything but words. You can see the theory laid out episode by episode if you know what to look for. You can see it in the way Cecil treats Mark differently from any other meta-human Cecil has ever managed. Cecil has been running the Global Defense Agency for decades. Cecil has handled dozens of heroes, dozens of cosmic threats, dozens of beings stronger than the human military could handle. And yet, with Mark, Cecil does something he never does with anyone else. He sits him down, he explains. He compromises, he bends his own rules, which are not really rules but operational protocols he has spent his entire adult life refining. Because he understands that Mark is not just the strongest hero on Earth right now. Mark is the only being on Earth with both the power and the moral architecture to eventually do something with that power that the Earth itself cannot. Cecil is not preparing Mark to be Earth's protector. Cecil is preparing Mark to be Earth's ambassador to a war that has not yet officially begun. You can see it in the way Alan, on his repeated visits, treats Mark as a peer rather than as a junior. Alan is older, more experienced, and physically the rough equal of a Viltrumite in his later evolutionary stage. He has every reason to treat Mark as the local kid he has been assigned to mentor. He does not. Alan treats Mark even early on as the future leader of the coalition that will eventually have to fight Viltrum. Alan brings him into conversations he should not be in. Alan tells him things the coalition of planets is not officially supposed to tell Earth representatives. Alan does this because Alan has been told, somewhere up the chain, that Mark is the one. The one what is not specified, but Alan behaves like a man who has been given a list of names that will matter in 100 years, and who has been told that Mark Grayson is at the top. You can see it in the way Mark's body, by the 3rd season, is beginning to do things that his father's body never quite did. The healing factor is faster, the strength is climbing, the endurance is expanding past the normal Viltrumite ceiling and into a region that the show has been very careful to flag without explaining. Mark is not just a Viltrumite. Mark is a hybrid Viltrumite, and the hybridization, far from making him weaker as Viltrumite culture would predict, is making him something new. The show is showing you this in tiny doses so that you do not notice the arc until you look back at it. And you can see it most clearly in the way Mark himself reacts every time he is given the chance to walk away. He does not walk away, not because he is locked in, because something inside him already knows he is not allowed to. He has the most powerful body in his species and a moral architecture that his species has spent generations training out of itself. Those two things together are a kind of address. Mark has the address of the Empire in his bones. The show is just waiting for the rest of him to read it. The theory says that this is what happens. In the long run, the Viltrumites will be reduced. The exact mechanism does not need to be specified for the theory to hold. It could be a virus. It could be a single catastrophic battle. It could be the slow attrition of a war the coalition cannot lose because it has too many planets to lose. Whatever the mechanism, the Empire's population eventually drops to a number that cannot sustain its current command structure. And when that happens, the surviving Viltrumites will have to choose a leader who is strong enough to keep them in line, and who is morally separate enough from their existing leadership to be acceptable to the worlds Viltrum has conquered. There is only one being in the universe who fits both of those criteria. There is only one being who is biologically a Viltrumite and culturally not one. There is only one being who could walk into the throne room on Viltrum and not get killed within 30 seconds for the offense of being a half-breed. Mark. The theory says Mark spends most of his adult life on Viltrum, ruling. The theory says he marries Eve, has a daughter, and watches that daughter inherit a level of power that exceeds his own. The theory says he loses people. The theory says he becomes harder than he ever wanted to be, and more compromised than he ever thought he would allow himself to become, and that the boy on the floor of Chicago will one day be a man on a throne. And the throne will be the same throne his father was sent from, and the question Nolan asked him on that floor will turn out to have been a prophecy. What will you have, Mark, when everyone you know is dead? You will have a planet of warriors. You will have a daughter who can level cities. You will have a wife who has remade her own biology 3 times over. You will have a brother. You will have an empire to either dismantle or to repurpose. You will have, in the end, a version of the thing Nolan was sent to build, that you built instead by accident, because you were trying to do the right thing in a universe that does not always allow it. And underneath that, you will still have the answer you gave him on the floor. You will still have him, not in a body, in the inheritance. In the fact that the choice he made to stay, the choice he made to fail his mission, the choice he made to smile at you before he flew away, was the choice that made every later choice possible. Mark, in the end, is the proof that Viltrum was wrong about itself, and the proof is published in the only language the Empire actually speaks, which is the language of a body that cannot be broken. This is the second theory. It is also, in a way, the only theory. Every other theory in this show, every theory about Cecil, about Conquest, about the Maulers, about Eve, about Angstrom, is really a small theory inside this larger one, working out a particular piece of the machinery that is taking Mark to that throne. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The show is a coming-of-age story whose ending is a coronation, which brings us to the man with the wire in his head, who has been quietly doing more to engineer that coronation than anyone else on Earth. The third theory is about Cecil Stedman, and about whether the director of the Global Defense Agency is a hero, a villain, or a third thing the moral vocabulary of the show has not quite settled on yet. The honest answer is the third thing. Cecil is a man who has, in his own private accounting, made peace with the idea that the survival of the species sometimes requires the moral compromise of its individuals, and who has been quietly running an operation along those lines for so long that he has stopped noticing where the operation ends and where he begins. You see the operation in pieces. You see it in Donald, who Cecil has revived and partially mechanized and altered multiple times. without Donald's full consent in most of those revivals. Because Donald is too useful and Cecil has decided that usefulness is a higher value than autonomy when the species is on the line. You see it in the Reanimen, which are not, despite the official cover story, simply confiscated assets seized from DA. Sinclair. They are an ongoing program that Cecil has continued in some quiet form, because the technology is too useful to throw away. And because there are eventualities Cecil is preparing for in which the Earth will need disposable super soldiers and will not have time to make them. You see it in the Mauler twins, who Cecil keeps on payroll for the explicit purpose of solving problems that the conventional scientific community cannot or will not solve. Because the Maulers are amoral enough to follow instructions that would make a normal scientist quit. You see it in the way Cecil treats Sinclair himself, not as a prisoner but as a contributor, because the line between criminal and contractor has blurred so completely in Cecil's mind that he no longer makes the distinction in operational terms. And you see it most damningly in the fact that Cecil has been keeping a Viltrumite trader alive in a sub-basement and using him to fight other Viltrumites, in violation of every ethical principle he claims to operate by. Because Cecil has done the math and decided that one war crime per decade is an acceptable cost if it buys him a continent killer he can point at the right enemy. The theory says that Cecil is not corrupt in the way other directors of secret agencies in fiction are corrupt. Cecil is not stealing money. Cecil is not building a personal empire. Cecil is not even by his own lights doing anything wrong. The theory says Cecil is something stranger. Cecil is a man who came into adulthood during the early years of metahuman emergence and who has spent his entire career watching the threat envelope expand faster than the Earth's institutions can respond to it. He has watched alien invasions. He has watched dimensional incursions. He has watched the appearance of beings whose mere existence rewrites the geopolitical assumptions of every government on the planet. And somewhere, probably very early, probably before most of the audience was born, Cecil made a decision that the only way to keep up with that envelope was to throw away the operational ethics that other institutions still pretend to follow, and to build an agency that could do what the moment required, regardless of how that looked on paper. That decision has consequences. It has the consequence that Mark, once he understands the full picture, cannot work with Cecil. It has the consequence that Donald, once he reassembles enough of his memory to understand what has been done to him, has to reckon with the fact that the man he served was using him as a renewable resource. It has the consequence that the Reanimen program, even if officially shuttered, will keep producing variants and casualties for years. And it has the consequence that when the Viltrumites finally come in force, the only being on Earth with the operational experience to coordinate the planetary defense will be the man who has spent his career pre-positioning every morally compromised asset for exactly this moment. The theory has a sharper edge. The sharper edge says Cecil knows, and has always known, that Mark is going to leave Earth. The sharper edge says Cecil is preparing Earth for the absence of its strongest defender by making sure that the Earth has, before Mark goes, a network of weapon systems, contingency programs, and morally flexible personnel that can hold the line in his absence. Every Reanimen is a future asset for a war Mark will not be on this planet to fight. Every Mauler invention is a future weapon for a war Cecil will not live to see. Every compromise Cecil makes is, in this reading, a brick in a wall he is building between Earth and the cosmos for the years after Mark has gone to take the throne. The theory does not exonerate Cecil. The theory complicates him. The theory says you cannot understand his behavior in the show as a series of individual ethical failures, because each one of those failures only makes sense as part of a long-range plan that Cecil has never been able to articulate to anyone, not even to himself. He is acting, in the present, on a calculation he made decades ago, and has never had the time to revise. He is running an agency on the assumption that the universe is more dangerous than the public is willing to accept, and that someone has to make the decisions the public would never permit if they knew. And he is, in the most uncomfortable sense, right. The Viltrumites are coming. The Coalition is coming. The dimensional incursions are increasing in frequency. The Maulers, left to their own devices, would have killed millions by now. Sinclair, left to his own devices, would have built an army. Cecil is the dam between Earth and several different floods. And the dam is built out of his own willingness to be a worse man than the people he is protecting would ever know. When Mark finally breaks with Cecil, when the relationship between the strongest hero on Earth and the most powerful unelected official on Earth ruptures, the show does something interesting. It does not let either of them be entirely right. Mark is right that Cecil's methods are unacceptable. Cecil is right that without those methods, the planet would already be dead. The show holds both of them in tension and asks you to decide which one of them you would rather be. The theory says you are not really being asked to decide. The theory says you are being shown that any planet with this level of threat exposure produces, as a structural necessity, A Cecil. That Cecil is not a villain because he is not a person. Cecil is a job. Cecil is the role that the geopolitical situation of Earth requires, and the man who currently holds the job is doing it about as well as the job can be done. The villain is the situation. Cecil is the symptom. When you look at Cecil through this theory, the late show moments when he sits alone in his office doing paperwork at 3 in the morning become readable in a way they were not before. He is not a man enjoying power. He is a man drowning in the cost of holding it. He is a man who has not slept properly in 20 years because every time he closes his eyes, he sees the spreadsheet of beings he has had to keep on retainer and the spreadsheet of beings he has had to authorize the deaths of. He is a man whose only consolation is that the wire in his own head, which has spent decades managing communications with assets across the planet, also functions as a kind of buffer between him and his own conscience. The wire keeps him from feeling things he cannot afford to feel. The theory is not kind to Cecil. The theory only allows that he is doing the job, and that the job is real, and that the job will outlive him, and that someone after him will have to inherit the agency, and the spreadsheets and the wire and the calculation that one war crime per decade is an acceptable cost. The theory says that even Cecil knows this, and that part of his quiet preparation of Mark over the years is the preparation of the only being on the planet who could ever be told the full truth of what the agency has done, and not collapse under the weight of it. Mark, of all of them, has the moral spine and the cosmic education to hear what Cecil has been doing and decide whether to dismantle it or to inherit it. Mark, in the end, does both. He dismantles the relationship and inherits the function. He will become, on Viltrum, a version of what Cecil was on Earth. A being who has to make decisions that no other being can or will make, who has to accept the moral compromise that comes with that, and who has to do it without the protection of an audience that fully understands what he is doing or why. The theory closes the loop. Cecil prepared Mark by being the kind of leader Mark would have to become. Mark will eventually become him. Which brings us to a Viltrumite who never had to prepare, who was built on Viltrum to be the version of himself that he is now, who arrived on Earth not as a defector, not as an experiment, but as the Empire's clearest expression of its own ideal. The fourth theory is about conquest and about what the Empire actually meant when it sent him to test the boy who refused to be tested. Conquest is not a soldier in the sense that Nolan was a soldier. Nolan was sent on assignments. Nolan was given strategic objectives. Nolan operated, even when he was being the perfect Viltrumite, as a kind of strategic instrument used by the Empire to acquire particular pieces of a universe. Conquest is something else. Conquest is the Empire's idea of what a Viltrumite should be, when no particular strategic purpose is being served. Conquest is the philosophical statement of Viltrumite culture, given a body and pointed at a target. When Thrag sends Conquest to Earth, he is not sending an assassin. If he wanted Mark dead, he would have come himself, or he would have sent a squad. He is sending a teacher. The teacher's curriculum is one lesson, and the lesson is that Mark, despite his lineage, despite his strength, despite his hybrid biology, is not a Viltrumite, and that the Empire does not have to fear him. Because in any actual confrontation between the Empire's idea of what a warrior is and Mark's confused, half-Earth understanding of the same, the Empire's idea will win. Conquest is the test that proves the theorem. The horrifying thing about the Conquest arc is that the test almost succeeds. Mark loses the fight. Mark loses it badly enough that Eve, in her panic, performs the most consequential act of her own arc by reaching into Mark's body and rebuilding it. And the act both reveals the true ceiling of her own powers and saves Mark's life. The fight is not a draw. Mark wins because he does not die, and because Conquest, under the very specific Viltrumite definition of victory, did not finish the lesson before the bell rang. But the fight, on its own terms, is a defeat. Conquest leaves Earth with the lesson partially delivered. And the lesson is that the Empire was right. The theory says that this is exactly what Thrag wanted. Not because Thrag wanted Mark broken, because Thrag wanted Mark to know what he was up against, and to know it in his bones, in a way that no diplomatic communication could ever have communicated. Thrag understands, far better than the rest of the Empire, that the long-term value of Mark is not whether he can be defeated, but whether he can be persuaded. And the first step in persuading a being to join your side is to demonstrate to him, beyond any rational doubt, that he cannot defeat your side by force. Conquest was the demonstration. You can see this in the way Conquest fights. Conquest does not fight like a soldier following a kill order. Conquest fights like a teacher who has been told to use any pedagogical technique necessary to make the student understand the material. He explains the lessons in real time. He compliments Mark when Mark does something correctly. He pauses several times to let Mark recover, not out of mercy, but because the lesson does not land if the student is too disoriented to receive it. He is, in his own grotesque way, attentive to Mark in a manner that no one in Mark's life on Earth has ever been, because no one on Earth has ever understood what Mark is or what Mark is being prepared to become. Conquest does. Conquest came across the galaxy to teach Mark a single thing, and the thing is that the Empire knows him better than he knows himself. The theory has a darker extension. The darker extension says that Conquest was not actually expected to survive the trip. That Thrag sent him knowing that there was a small but real chance that Mark, in extremis, would tap into something he had not yet accessed, and that if he did, Conquest would die, and the death of Conquest would be the second half of the lesson. Because if Mark could kill Conquest, then Mark would understand for the first time in his life that he was capable of killing a Viltrumite, and that the prohibition against killing that he had been carrying around since his father's defection was not actually a prohibition. It was a limitation, and the limitation had a ceiling, and the ceiling could be broken by sufficient need. Mark does break it. Mark does not kill Conquest in their first fight, but he breaks something inside himself that allows him, in later fights, to do what Earthmark would never have done. The fight is the moment Mark becomes a being who can take a life. And once a being has taken a life, the second life is exponentially easier than the first. Thrag, who is centuries old, who has watched Viltrumite after Viltrumite crossed this threshold, knew exactly what he was doing when he sent the test. The fourth theory says, then, that Conquest is not really a villain in the narrative sense. Conquest is a developmental milestone in Mark's training, deliberately scheduled by an empire that has been planning his eventual incorporation for longer than he has been alive. Conquest is the moment Mark becomes capable of what he will need to become capable of in order to do the job he does not yet know he is going to take. And the strangest part of the theory is that Conquest, who is the Empire's purest expression, would have understood this completely. The Empire raised him to be a piece of a larger calculation, and he was not insulted by being used as a piece. He went to Earth knowing he might die. He fought knowing the death would be educational. If you could ask him at the end of his arc whether he regretted the trip, he would not understand the question. The trip was the assignment. The assignment was completed. There is nothing to regret. Which is exactly what makes the Empire terrifying, and exactly what makes Mark's eventual coronation so charged with significance. He will be inheriting the leadership of a culture in which beings like Conquest are not seen as monsters, but as ideals. He will have to govern them. He will have to either change what they consider an ideal, or accept that he has become the leader of the very ideology he refused, as a boy, to inherit from his father. Conquest, in this theory, is the first ambassador from Mark's future. The future is asking him whether he is ready. The future is not, on this question, particularly patient. The fifth theory is about another visitor from the same galactic neighborhood, one who has been arriving on Earth for almost as long as Mark has been alive, and who has been treated by the show as a friendly recurring presence, a reliable comic beat, a source of cosmic news, a delivery man of progressively heavier exposition. He is also, if the theory is correct, the second most carefully designed being in the entire series. The theory is about Alan and about what the coalition of planets has been doing to him, on purpose, while letting him believe that the things being done to him are accidents. Alan does not know he is a project. Alan believes that he is the result of a genetic experiment that went wrong, that he was given Viltrumite-grade physiology by mistake, that his ongoing physical evolution after each defeat in combat is a quirk of his particular biology. The Coalition has allowed him to believe this for decades, partly because telling him the truth would compromise his usefulness, and partly because the truth is too disturbing to inflict on a being who is otherwise quite happy in his work. The truth, in the theory, is that Alan is not the result of a mistake. Alan is the Coalition's deliberate attempt to grow a being capable of matching the median Viltrumite warrior in a one-on-one fight. And the experiment has been running for the duration of Alan's life. You can see the machinery of the project if you look for it. You can see it in the fact that Alan's evolutionary jumps always happen after he has been beaten by a Viltrumite, in the immediate hours following the beating, while he is recovering in a Coalition medical facility. The Coalition's official explanation is that Alan's body responds to extreme stress by adapting to it, the way a muscle responds to a heavy load by becoming larger. The unofficial explanation is that the Coalition's medical staff has been injecting him with stabilizing agents during his recovery period that lock in adaptations the body would otherwise discard, and that the medical staff has standing orders from Thetis to do this without informing the patient. Thetis, who is himself a Viltrumite defector, and therefore one of the only beings in the Coalition with a personal stake in the war's outcome, has reason to want Alan as strong as possible. Thetis also has reason to keep Alan in the dark about the project. A being who knows he is being engineered will behave differently in combat than a being who believes his strength is natural. A being who believes his strength is natural will take risks that a being who knows he is the product of a multi-decade investment will hesitate to take. The Coalition needs Alan to take the risks. The Coalition has therefore decided that the truth is a liability that the project cannot afford to introduce. This is a difficult theory to look at because Alan is one of the show's most likable characters, and the implication that the institution he works for has been lying to him about his own body for his entire adult life is the kind of betrayal the show does not typically inflict on characters of his temperament. But the theory is not really about Alan's victimization. The theory is about what the Coalition is willing to do, in the long war against Viltrum, to produce a champion. And the answer the theory gives is that the Coalition will do anything, including the slow, patient, hidden engineering of a being who thinks he is just an ordinary alien with an unusual hobby of getting into fights. The theory has consequences that ripple through the rest of the show. If Alan is a project, then Mark, for the Coalition, is the second iteration of the same project. Mark is what happens when the engineering does not have to be hidden, because the subject is born with the genetics directly, rather than having to have them grafted on through a process of stress-induced adaptation. Mark is, from the Coalition's perspective, the version of Alan that did not require any of the deception. He is the natural-born answer to the question the Coalition has been trying to engineer Alan into being. Which is why, in the theory, Alan treats Mark with a kind of deference that does not quite make sense if you read Alan as just an older mentor figure. Alan has been told, by someone in the Coalition leadership, that Mark is the future, not the future hero, the future leader, the being who will eventually be in the position to end the war on terms that the Coalition has been trying to engineer toward for the entire span of Alan's career. Alan knows, or has been told, that his entire arc is a kind of placeholder, an interim solution to a problem that the universe has been working on for generations, and that the real solution is a boy on a small blue planet who has not yet figured out what he is. The theory does not soften the betrayal of Alan by his own institution. The theory only contextualizes it. The Coalition was not lying to Alan out of cruelty. The Coalition was lying to him because the lie was operationally necessary, because Thetis had calculated that Alan would not survive the truth without compromising his combat performance, and because the war the Coalition is fighting has no margin for the kind of psychological adjustment that the truth would require. The lie was the kindness the Coalition could afford to offer. The truth would have been a different kind of weight, and the weight would have arrived at a time when Alan could not have carried it. When Alan eventually does learn the truth, in the comic, the way he reacts is one of the more revealing character moments in the entire run. He does not collapse, he does not rage, he does not retire. He recalibrates, he sees very quickly that the project he was part of was a project he would have volunteered for if anyone had asked him, and that the only real crime committed against him was the failure to ask. He forgives Thetis eventually because he can see the cost of the decision Thetis had to make. He does not forgive the institution because the institution does not have a person to forgive, but he goes on doing the work because the work is still necessary and because the universe still needs a champion who can stand up to a Viltrumite squad without dying in the first 30 seconds. The theory says then that Alan is not a victim. Alan is a participant in a long collaboration that the institution simply forgot to tell him he had agreed to. The retrospective consent is unsatisfying, but the consent is real, because Alan, given the choice, would have made the same choice. The theory says that there is a kind of trust that institutions develop with their long-serving members, in which the institution acts on the member's behalf in ways that the member has not formally authorized, but would have authorized if the conversation had happened. The Coalition trusted Alan. Alan, in the end, trusted the Coalition back. The lie was the substrate of the trust, not the violation of it. You can read Mark's eventual relationship with the same institution through this. Mark is the version of the project that does not require the lie. The Coalition can be honest with Mark in a way it could not be honest with Alan, because Mark's genetics are an open fact rather than a hidden manipulation. Mark can negotiate, Mark can decline, Mark can set terms. The Coalition has been waiting for this version of the project for so long that, when Mark arrives in the position to make decisions, the Coalition will treat him with a deference that even Alan has not earned. Mark will be, in the Coalition's eyes, the answer to the question that Alan was only ever an attempt at. This is part of why the eventual political alignment in the late game of the series is so complicated. Mark cannot just be Earth's champion. Mark cannot just be the Coalition's champion. Mark is the only being in the universe who is positioned to be both, and to broker a peace, and to inherit the leadership of the empire that the war was being fought against in the first place. Alan is too narrow a piece on the board to play a role. Alan is a champion. Mark is going to be a head of state. The Coalition has known this on some level for the entire duration of its investment in Alan. Alan was the prototype. Mark is the product. When you watch Alan now with the theory in mind, the friendliness reads differently. The cheerful demeanor reads as the result of a life lived in deliberate ignorance of how his own existence was orchestrated. The visits to Earth read as the work of a man who has been told to befriend the heir without telling the heir what he is. The slow, almost paternal way Alan brings Mark into Coalition matters reads as the slow handoff of responsibility from one generation of champion to the next, with neither generation fully understanding the choreography of their own meeting. It is not a tragic theory. Alan, in the end, is happy. Alan does not seem to regret his life even when he learns what was done to it. The theory is only sad in the way that any long institutional truth is sad, in the way that knowing what your government did in your name 50 years ago is sad even if you cannot, in good conscience, say you would have stopped them. The theory says that the war against Viltrum required this. The war against Viltrum did not consult the people whose lives it would shape. The war against Viltrum produced as a byproduct a galaxy-class warrior who thought he was an accident, and a hybrid boy who thought he was an outlier, and a director on Earth who thought he was making decisions alone, and an empire whose own purest expression was, in the end, only one more piece in a calculation none of them could see from the inside. Alan is the human face of that calculation. Mark is its conclusion. Which brings us to a different kind of person, or a person in a different kind of body, or a body containing a person who is no longer entirely sure what the relationship between the two is. The sixth theory is about Rudolph Connors, who was born with a body that betrayed him every day of his early life, and who built, with the only tools he had, a way out of that body, and who has been living ever since with a question the show has been very careful not to answer. Rudy Connors is one of the most quietly tragic figures in the entire series, and you do not realize how tragic he is until you understand the full sequence of his self-modifications. He was born in a body so disabled that ordinary movement was impossible for him. He compensated by becoming very young, one of the most brilliant minds on the planet, capable of designing remote-controlled drones and synthetic exoskeletons, and eventually a full robotic chassis that he piloted from a sealed life support tank. The robotic chassis was Robot. Robot was for years the body in which Rudy lived his public life, and the body in which the Teen Team and later the Guardians of the Globe knew him. The chassis was not a body. The chassis was a vehicle. Rudy was always inside the tank, somewhere in a basement, listening through speakers and seeing through cameras. This is important. This is the precondition for what comes next. What comes next is that Rudy decides, after years of operating through the chassis, that he wants to occupy a real body, not a remote vehicle. Not a synthetic chassis, a body of flesh with all the sensory apparatus and motor capacity that come with it. He commissions the Mauler twins to clone a body for him. Not just any body, a specific body, a body modeled on a teenage version of Rex Splode, his teammate, with whom he has a complicated relationship that the show has danced around in a way that even the comic, which is less restrained, does not always know what to do with. The clone is grown. The brain is transferred. Rudy now occupies, for the first time in his life, a body that walks and runs and feels. And here is where the theory begins to ask its question. The question is whether the person who walks out of that procedure is still Rudy Connors. The question is the oldest question in transplant ethics, and the oldest question in continuity of identity philosophy, and the oldest question in any story about consciousness moving from one substrate to another. The question is whether identity survives the move. The show, very carefully, never gives you a definitive answer. The show only gives you behavior. The behavior is suggestive. The behavior of post-transfer Rudy is not the same as the behavior of pre-transfer Rudy. Pre-transfer Rudy was cautious, withdrawn, somewhat embittered by his circumstances, and emotionally regulated in a way that suggested decades of practice at suppressing feelings he could not act on. Post-transfer Rudy is impulsive. He pursues Monster Girl, who is in the body of a girl but who is, by accumulated experience, much older than the body she occupies, in a way that pre-transfer Rudy would not have allowed himself. He makes decisions on shorter time horizons. He takes physical risks. He acts in many small ways like a person who has been given access to a new kind of pleasure and who is making up for lost time by using it. The theory says these are not random changes. The theory says the body, in a being like Rudy, is not just a vehicle. The body is part of the consciousness. When Rudy moved into the new body, he did not just gain mobility. He gained the entire endocrine and neurological substrate of a teenage organism. And that substrate carries with it a set of biological imperatives that the consciousness, however refined, cannot fully override. The post-transfer Rudy is, in part, the chemistry of the body he is now occupying. The original Rudy is still there, philosophically, but the chemistry has a vote, and the chemistry has been voting heavily. This raises a question the show only asks obliquely. The question is whether Rudy has done something to himself that he does not have the framework to recognize. He thought he was moving into a body. He was in some sense also moving into a person, because the body he commissioned was grown from another person's genetic template and carries some echo of that person's neural architecture in the way the brain wiring developed during cloning. The body is not a blank slate. The body is a partial echo of the person it was cloned from. Rudy is, in some quiet way, sharing his consciousness with the ghost of a body that was never asked to be made. The theory does not resolve this. The theory only points out that the show has been showing you the consequences of it for several seasons. Rudy's increasing willingness to make decisions he would not have made before. Rudy's somewhat baffling pivot toward more authoritarian political philosophy, which the comic eventually develops to the point of Rudy actually attempting to seize control of major Earth governments under the belief that he can administer them better than the existing leadership. Rudy's tendency to construct elaborate rational justifications for actions that, in his pre-transfer life, he would have recognized as ethically unacceptable. All of these are the symptoms of a consciousness that has been compromised, slowly by the substrate it now occupies, and that has lost the ability to perceive its own compromise. The theory has a darker extension. The darker extension says that the original Rudy, the consciousness that was scanned and transferred, never actually arrived in the new body. The transfer was not a move. The transfer was a copy. The original Rudy died in the tank, and what walks around now is a new being who has the memories of Rudy and who believes himself to be Rudy, but who is in fact a separate person who has been wearing Rudy's identity since the moment he opened his cloned eyes. This is the standard objection to teleportation. It is, here, an objection to brain transfer. The show does not commit to this reading. The show only allows it. If this is true, then the most morally interesting question in the entire show is whether the new Rudy is responsible for the actions of the old Rudy. The new Rudy did not commission the cloning. The new Rudy did not pay the molars. The new Rudy did not make the decision to put his consciousness in a body that did not consent to host it. The new Rudy woke up in a situation that was set up for him, and the situation has been shaping him ever since. He is, in this reading, both the perpetrator and the victim of his own existence, and there is no court in the universe that has a procedure for adjudicating that. You can see how the theory complicates the show's later treatment of Rudy. When Rudy makes the increasingly authoritarian moves that define his later arc, the show is not just showing you a character drift. The show is showing you what happens when a being who has been chemically and existentially altered by his own self-experiment loses the ability to perceive the alteration. He is not, in his own self-understanding, becoming a different person. He is, in his own self-understanding, becoming a clearer version of himself, because the new body has cleared away some of the suffering that the old body imposed on him. And he interprets the absence of that suffering as the presence of new clarity. The clarity is the chemistry. The new self is not a more honest Rudy. The new self is a Rudy who has lost access to the limits that the old body imposed on him, and who mistakes the loss for liberation. The theory closes with the observation that Rudy's arc is, structurally, a warning. A warning about what happens when a being acquires the capacity to redesign itself faster than its philosophy can keep up with the redesign. A warning about what happens when the technology of self-modification outpaces the wisdom required to use it responsibly. A warning that even the most carefully planned upgrade can produce a being who is not the upgraded version of you, but a slightly different person wearing your memories. The show offers Rudy as a small-scale model of a much larger problem that the universe will soon have to face on a civilizational scale, when the Viltrumites' breeding program, the Coalition's engineering of beings like Alan, and the rapid development of Earth's biotech all begin to converge on the same question. The question is whether identity can survive being chosen. The question is whether a being can decide to become a different being and remain after the decision, the being who did the deciding. The show does not answer the question. The show only shows you Rudy before and after, and asks you to make your own assessment. When you watch the show with this theory in mind, every interaction with Rudy becomes charged with a quiet melancholy. The man in the body is happy. The man in the body believes he is finally living. The man in the body does not know what he has lost, because the part of him that could have recognized the loss is the part of him that did not, in any meaningful sense, survive the transfer. You are watching a ghost convince itself it is a person. The show is letting the ghost have its moment. The ghost does not know that is what it is. Which brings us naturally to the two beings who built the body, whose entire shared existence is a smaller, sharper version of the same question. The seventh theory is about the Mahler twins, and about which of the two is the original, and about why the question may not have an answer that the universe is required to honor. The Mauler twins in the show's introductory framing are presented as a pair. They are scientists. They are mercenaries. They are physically identical. They share in some general way a single intellectual project and a single set of motivations, and they are, in their joint operations, almost interchangeable. The show plays this for comedy at first. The comedy is that they argue with each other constantly about which one is the original and which one is the clone, with the original insisting on its primacy and the clone insisting that the distinction is meaningless. The argument is one of the show's longer-running comedic motifs. The argument is also, if you take it seriously, one of the show's most pointed philosophical provocations. The Maulers occupy a very specific position in the larger ethics of cloning that the show keeps returning to. Their existence raises a question that the show is not interested in answering in their own arc, but that the show wants you to be thinking about when other arcs raise the same question in higher stakes contexts. The question is whether the existence of a clone undermines the identity of the original. The Maulers' insistence on adjudicating this question is, in their own case, almost academic. They both function. They both have memories. They both have agency. The question of priority is, in functional terms, irrelevant to their joint operation. They could simply both be the Maulers. The fact that they do not just both be the Maulers, the fact that they keep arguing about who is the real one is the part of their dynamic that the theory wants to interrogate. The theory says that the argument is not actually about priority. The argument is about loneliness. The argument is about the fact that each Mauler on some level understands that his existence has been duplicated, and that the duplication has reduced the cosmic significance of his individual consciousness by half. If there are two of you, then neither of you is unique. If neither of you is unique, then the philosophical weight that your individual existence carried before the duplication is now distributed across two bodies, and the distribution feels to each of you like a loss. The argument about which one is the original is the argument by which each Mauler is trying to reclaim the cosmic significance he had before the other Mauler existed. The argument is a coping mechanism. The argument is not, and was never, going to be resolved, because the resolution would not actually return the lost significance. The argument is the way the Maulers grieve for the singularity they once had, and will never have again. This is why the show treats the Maulers, despite their cartoonish presentation, with a kind of quiet seriousness in certain late arc moments. When one of the Maulers dies, the surviving one does not just lose a colleague. He loses the only being in the universe who was running the same experiment on the same question that he was. He loses the only mirror. He loses the only person who understood the loneliness of being half of a duplicated self. The grief, when it arrives, is not the grief of losing a brother. It is the grief of finally being alone with a question that he can no longer share. The theory has a darker extension. The darker extension says that the Maulers, far from being a comedic distraction in the show, are the prototype for every later cloning event in the series, and that their treatment by the show is a kind of forecast for the treatment of every subsequent clone. Robot was made because the Maulers existed. The technology for full brain transfer into a cloned body was developed by them. The technology was offered to Rudy because the Maulers had it to offer. Every later instance of cloning in the series traces back, technologically and ethically, to the Mauler project. The Maulers are not just clones. They are the inventors of the entire cloning ecosystem the show operates inside. This means that the question they spend their lives arguing about is the same question the show keeps imposing on every other character who undergoes a similar procedure. Mark, when he meets variants of himself across dimensions, will face it. Rudy, when he transfers his consciousness, faces it. Oliver, who is genetically half Viltrumite and half Thraxan, and whose accelerated development raises questions about whether the person who emerges in adolescence is the same person who was the infant a year before, faces it. The Maulers were the first to face it, and they have spent their lives developing the only coping mechanism their philosophy was capable of inventing. The coping mechanism is the argument. The argument keeps the question alive without ever resolving it. The argument is the way you live with a question that cannot be answered. The theory closes with the observation that the show has never told you which Mauler is the original. The comic has not told you. The writers have not told you. The internal logic of the show does not allow the question to be answered, because the question is structurally insoluble. The two Maulers have identical memories of their pre-duplication life. The two Maulers have identical neural architectures, modified only slightly by the divergent experiences they have had since duplication. There is no test that could distinguish them. There is no document that could prove priority. There is, in the universe of the show, no fact of the matter. What the show is showing you, then, is that the question of which Mauler is original is the same question the universe is going to have to face on a much larger scale as the technology proliferates. Identity, when it can be duplicated, is no longer a thing you have. Identity becomes a thing that has to be negotiated between beings who all have equal claim to it, and the negotiation has no neutral arbiter. The Maulers have been performing this negotiation in front of you for the entire show. They have not solved it. No one has. The theory says that the show is preparing you, slowly, for a future in which this is the condition of consciousness itself, and in which beings will have to learn to live with the loss of cosmic uniqueness that their ancestors took for granted. It is a heavier conclusion than the show usually permits the Maulers to carry. The show, knowing this, lets the Maulers be unbearable. The funniness is the way they survive. The funniness is the way they make the question small enough to live inside. The Maulers in this reading are the smallest and most honest theologians in the show. They have been wrestling in comic dialogue with the largest question consciousness has yet had to answer, and they have done it without ever once pretending the question is easy. They have just done it in voices that make you laugh. The theory does not require you to feel sorry for them. The theory only asks you to notice that the laugh is a kind of grief. Which brings us to a girl who has been quietly the most powerful character in the show since the moment she was introduced, and who has spent most of her arc operating at a small fraction of her actual capability, because the show has been hiding her ceiling from you, and, more importantly, from her. The eighth theory is about Samantha Eve Wilkins, and about why the artificial limit she has been told her powers obey has always been a lie, and about what happens when she stops believing it. Adam Eve, in the show's early framing, manipulates matter. The story she has been told about her powers is that she can rearrange inorganic material at the atomic level, that she can build and destroy and reshape things, but that she cannot affect organic matter because organic matter is too complex, or because her power has some kind of biological exclusion built into it, or because she is genetically prohibited from operating on the kind of carbon chain structures that constitute living tissue. She believes this story. The Guardians believe this story. The men in her life have, with varying degrees of paternalism, reinforced this story. The story is false. The story was constructed by her father when she was a small child because he was afraid of what would happen if she ever tested the actual limits of her power. The lie was a kind of safety harness. The lie was meant to keep her from accidentally killing herself or someone else before she had developed the maturity to control what she was doing. The lie became the truth in her head because she had no reason to question it, and because the people who knew the lie had every reason to keep it in place. What her power actually is, as a baseline, is the capacity to manipulate matter at the atomic level without exclusion. All matter, including organic, including the matter of her own body, including the matter of other people's bodies, including, in the extreme case, the matter of structures the size of cities or eventually planets. She is, in the comic's eventual confirmation, one of the most powerful entities the universe has ever produced, and the only thing that has been keeping her from operating at that level is the belief that she cannot. The show has been telegraphing this for several seasons. It has been telegraphing it in the way her powers have a slight overflow when she is emotionally compromised. It has been telegraphing it in the way her recovery from injury accelerates faster than any inorganic-only power set would explain. It has been telegraphing it most explicitly in the moment after the conquest fight, when Mark is dying and Eve, in pure desperate panic, reaches into his body with her power and rebuilds the damaged tissue from the cellular level up. That moment was not just Eve saving Mark. That moment was Eve breaking the harness her father had installed, because the love she had for Mark was, in that instant, larger than the lie she had been believing about herself. After that moment, the story she has been told about her powers stops working. She knows. She has known on some level since the second her hands were inside Mark's body and the tissue was responding to her like clay. The harness is gone. The ceiling is gone. The only thing left between her and her actual capability is her own willingness to test the limits, and the question of what testing those limits will do to her sense of who she is. The theory says this is the larger question of her entire arc, and the show has been telling it slowly, because the alternative would be to introduce a character whose power level invalidates most of the dramatic stakes of the other characters around her. Eve, operating at her full capacity, can do things that none of the rest of the cast can do. Eve, operating at her full capacity, can kill a Viltrumite with a thought because she can decompose the Viltrumite's molecular structure faster than the Viltrumite's healing factor can reassemble it. Eve, operating at her full capacity, can build and unbuild planets. Eve, operating at her full capacity, is, in functional terms, a low-grade god. The show does not let her get there in a single jump. The show lets her get there in increments, because the increments are what produces the character study. The character study is about a woman who has been told her whole life that she is less than she is, and who is slowly, painfully, sometimes terrifyingly, discovering what she is. Each increment costs her something. Each new capability she unlocks comes with a moral weight she has to figure out how to carry. She is, in this reading, not just becoming more powerful, she is becoming, very slowly, more responsible for what her power could do. And the responsibility is more frightening than the power itself. You can see the increments. You can see the moment she heals an injury that should have been fatal. You can see the moment she restructures the matter of a building to evacuate civilians faster than the building can collapse on them. You can see the moment late in the comic and forecast in the show when she does something with her own body that no being who fully understood the consequences would do without serious preparation. She rebuilds parts of herself to extend her lifespan to match Mark's. She does this because the alternative is to watch Mark live for thousands of years while she ages and dies in 100. The act of rebuilding herself is the act of refusing to accept the conventional human limit. It is also the act of betting that her sense of who she is can survive a substantial alteration of the substrate that supports it. It can. She is, in the comic, still herself after the alteration. She is older. She is more powerful. She is wiser. She has not lost the things that made her Eve. The bet pays off, and the payoff is that she becomes, in the late stages of the story, one half of the most consequential partnership in the universe. She and Mark together are the architects of whatever comes after the Viltrumite Empire is reduced. They are the parents of the next generation of cosmic governance. Which brings us to the daughter. The daughter is the part of the theory that the show has been most carefully hiding, because the daughter, in the comic, is the most powerful being who has ever lived. Her name is Marky, short for Mark, after her father. She was named for him while she was still in the womb, before the parents had any idea what she was going to be. What she turned out to be is a being whose Viltrumite heritage on one side and Adam-Eve heritage on the other combined to produce a creature whose physical strength approaches the upper limits of what a Viltrumite can produce, and whose energy manipulation powers approach the upper limits of what Eve can produce, and who therefore has, in a single body, the offensive capacity of two of the most powerful beings in the universe operating in concert. The comic, which has the courage to take this premise seriously, treats Marky as a kind of philosophical problem. What does it mean to be the most powerful being who has ever lived? What is your responsibility? What are your relationships with the parents who produced you? How do you grow up in a body that exceeds the bodies of the people who raised you? How do you stay sane? Marky stays sane, mostly because her parents are sane. Marky stays sane because the parents have, by the time she is born, accumulated enough experience with their own power and the moral weight of their own choices to be able to guide her without crushing her. Marky is, in this reading, the third generation of the Grayson Project. Nolan was the first. Mark was the second. Marky is the third, and she is the one in whom the project finally arrives at a being who has been raised from birth with the values that Nolan came to too late and that Mark had to construct in real time. Marky is the proof that the family worked. The proof is a small girl who can level a continent and chooses every day not to. The theory says that Eve's arc in the show is the arc of a woman becoming the kind of being who can produce that daughter. The arc is not just about power. The arc is about the moral spine that has to develop in tandem with the power. The arc is about a woman learning to carry the weight of being a low-grade god while remaining, in her core, a person who loves a man and wants a child and is willing to do the work to be the mother that child will need. Eve, by the end of her arc, is not just an Adam-Eve. She is a Samantha Wilkins who has integrated the Adam-Eve into herself rather than the other way around. The integration is the achievement. You can read Marky then as the proof that the integration succeeded. Marky exists because Eve was able to do the work. Marky is the future not just of the Grayson line, but of the species-level project the show has been quietly running since the beginning. The project is the production of a being who has the power to rewrite the universe and who chooses not to. The project is the production of a being whose power is restrained by something other than the universe's failure to give her more power. Marky restrains herself. Marky's restraint is the cumulative wisdom of 3 generations of Graysons and 2 parents who learned to love each other carefully enough to deserve her. The theory closes with the observation that Eve is, in this reading, the show's most quietly radical character. She is the only character whose arc is explicitly about the moral development required to use cosmic scale power responsibly. She is the only character who has to do the work in real time, on screen, with the full weight of the consequences visible to the audience. Mark gets to learn his lessons through fights with other Viltrumites. Eve has to learn her lessons by sitting with the question of whether she should heal a stranger she does not know, by sitting with the question of whether her father had any right to install the harness, by sitting with the question of whether she wants to be the kind of being who can do what she can do. The fights are not the lesson. The sitting is the lesson. Eve, in the long run, is the wisest character in the show, because she is the only one who has had to think this carefully for this long. When you watch her now, with this theory in mind, the moments of quiet between her and Mark take on a different weight. She is not just his girlfriend. She is not just his eventual wife. She is the only being on the planet who has any real chance of matching him at the scale he is going to operate at. And the relationship between them is the most consequential alliance the show contains. The show treats it as a love story. The show is right too. The love story is, in cosmic terms, the most important political event in several generations of galactic history. The love story is the foundation of what comes after the Empire. Eve is the architect of that foundation. The harness is gone. The ceiling is gone. The only thing left is the work. And Eve, of all of them, is the most ready to do it. The ninth theory is about a different kind of architecture, and about a being who has spent his life trying to build, from broken pieces of doors that should never have been opened, a single coherent picture of a multiverse that may or may not actually have a center. The ninth theory is about Angstrom Levy, and about whether the version of him you have met is the version of him you should be most afraid of. Angstrom Levy, in the show's introduction, is a scientist with a peaceful purpose. His project is to access alternative versions of his own consciousness across parallel timelines, to consult with versions of himself who have followed different research paths, and to assemble from the consultations a kind of cumulative wisdom that no single version of himself could have produced alone. The project is, in its initial framing, a beautiful one. The project is an attempt to use the multiverse as a library of selves. The project is an attempt to learn from your own roads not taken. The project goes catastrophically wrong. The accident that goes wrong is, on the surface, the accident of Mark accidentally interrupting the procedure and causing the energy of the cross-dimensional connection to lash back at Angstrom's body and brain. The accident leaves Angstrom physically scarred and, more consequentially, neurologically altered. He is no longer one Angstrom. He is the cumulative consciousness of every Angstrom he was in contact with at the moment of the accident. And the cumulative consciousness has not integrated. It is a parliament of selves crammed into a single skull, with no chair and no agreed upon agenda, and the only thing the parliament can agree on is that the accident was Mark's fault. The theory says that the version of Angstrom you meet after the accident is not the Angstrom you met before. The version after the accident is, more accurately, the Parliament. The Parliament has selected from among the available agendas the agenda that the largest number of Angstroms can endorse, and the agenda is revenge. Not because the Parliament is collectively evil, because the Parliament has too many voices to agree on anything more ambitious than a shared grievance, and the grievance is the only thing the Parliament can act on with consensus. This is why post-accident Angstrom behaves the way he does. He is not making decisions as one person. He is making decisions as a committee that has been forced to govern a single body. The committee is large. The committee is exhausted. The committee has very little capacity for nuance, because every nuanced decision triggers internal disagreement, and the internal disagreement is too painful for the body to sustain. The committee therefore restricts itself to simple decisions. The simple decisions are mostly variations on the theme of hurting Mark. The theory has a darker extension. The darker extension says that the Parliament, over the course of the post-accident period, is slowly being culled. Some of the Angstroms inside the body are stronger than others. The strong ones are slowly winning the internal disputes by exhausting the weaker ones, by drowning out the weaker ones, by gradually colonizing more of the body's executive functions, until the weaker ones can no longer make themselves heard. The Angstrom you see by the late stages of his arc is increasingly the version of him that was, in some original universe, the worst possible version of Angstrom Levy. The version that all the other Angstroms had been hoping never to become. The version that, in the Parliament's first sessions, was a marginal voice arguing for extreme measures and being overruled. By the late sessions, the extreme voice has won, because the extreme voice was the only voice with enough sustained anger to outlast everyone else. This is what Angstrom is in the late arc. He is not the scientist who started the project. He is the worst version of the scientist who has slowly taken control of the Parliament by attrition. He is, in this reading, what happens when you give a being the experience of all his possible selves and then force him to live with the worst one in the driver's seat. The theory has a still darker extension. The darker extension says that Mark, in the multiverse, has the same potential. There are versions of Mark across the multiverse who made different choices. There are versions of Mark who became Viltrumite conquerors. There are versions of Mark who allied with Nolan and helped to subjugate Earth. There are versions of Mark who were never raised by Debbie and who grew up without the moral compass that makes Mark in the universe you are watching the person he is. The multiverse contains a population of Marks, and the population includes some Marks who are, in functional terms, monsters. The theory says that Angstrom in his late arc actions has been showing Mark the multiverse not as a threat to be defeated, but as a mirror to be looked into. Every time Angstrom drags Mark to another universe, every time Angstrom forces Mark to fight a version of himself, every time Angstrom shows Mark a world that another Mark has destroyed, Angstrom is, on some half-conscious level, trying to teach Mark the lesson that the Parliament has been trying to teach itself. The lesson is that any being's identity is more fragile than it thinks, and that the difference between the version of you that is a hero and the version of you that is a monster is not a difference of essence, but a difference of circumstance. Mark in the show has been resisting this lesson with everything he has. He insists every time he is shown another Mark that he is not that Mark. He insists that the difference is real. He insists that he, the specific Mark in front of you, is the one who has the moral architecture to remain the hero across any circumstance the multiverse can throw at him. The insistence is the spine of his character. It is also, in the theory, the thing the late arc Angstrom is trying to demolish. Whether Angstrom succeeds is one of the open questions of the show. The comic eventually gives an answer. The answer is that Mark, in the worst of all possible confrontations with himself, manages to remain himself, but only barely, and only because the people he loves are willing to stand with him in a moment when his own self-belief would have failed him alone. The answer is not that he is essentially better than the other Marks. The answer is that he is better than them in this specific circumstance, because the circumstance includes Eve and Debbie and Oliver and the relationships he has built across the years. And the relationships are what hold the identity together when the identity itself begins to come apart. The theory closes with the observation that Angstrom, in his late arc, is the most philosophically rigorous antagonist the show has produced. He is not evil. He is not even properly an antagonist in the conventional sense. He is a counter-thesis. He is the proposition that the multiverse, taken seriously, dissolves the idea of moral identity, because any being who could be otherwise is, in some sense, already otherwise. The proposition is corrosive. The proposition is not wrong. The show does not give you the resources to refute the proposition. The show only gives you Mark, who keeps choosing to be himself every day in defiance of the proposition's logical force. You can read the multiverse arcs of the show, then, as the show's most explicit philosophical confrontation. The confrontation is between Angstrom's view of identity as contingent and Mark's view of identity as chosen. The contingency view is, formally, the stronger argument. The choice view is, in practice, the only one that allows a being to function. Mark's persistence in choosing himself, against the cumulative weight of all the other selves he could have been, is the show's quiet answer to the question of how to live in a multiverse without losing your mind. The answer is that you live by choosing. The choosing is the answer. The choosing is the only answer. Angstrom does not survive the confrontation. Mark does. The show, on this question, sides with the chooser. The show is, on this question, optimistic in a way it does not allow itself to be on most others. The theory closes with the observation that the version of Angstrom you have feared most was the version that the Parliament could not stop, and that the show has been telling you all along what the worst version of any being looks like when no one inside him has the strength to overrule it. The lesson is for Mark. The lesson is for you. The lesson is that the worst version of any of us exists, somewhere in some configuration of circumstance, and that the only protection against that version becoming dominant is the daily repeated work of choosing the version you want to be. The choosing has to be done in public. The choosing has to be done in the relationships you have. The choosing has to be done with the help of people who can hold you to your better self when your worse self has the floor. Mark has those people. Angstrom did not. The difference is not essential. The difference is sufficient. The 10th theory is about a brother, who is also a half-brother, who is also a child of an interspecies union that the show has been very careful not to philosophize about. But whose existence is one of the larger philosophical statements the show has made about the question of accelerated time, and the question of what it means to come into moral consciousness in a body that the universe is not prepared to wait for. The 10th theory is about Oliver, who is sometimes called Kid Omni-Man, who is biologically half Thraxant and half Viltrumite, who ages roughly 6 times faster than a human child, and whose entire developmental arc has been compressed into a window so short that you may not have noticed how strange it is. Oliver, when you first meet him, is a small child. By the end of the 2nd season, he is functionally a young adult, with the body of a teenager and the social development of someone who has crammed into a few years what humans would expect to spread across decades. He has Viltrumite-level physical strength, modified by his Thraxan heritage in ways the show has not fully spelled out. He has, very importantly, a different moral framework from the one that Mark has been laboriously constructing for himself. And the difference is not, in the show, treated as the difference between a hero and a villain. The difference is treated as the difference between two ways of thinking about consequence. Mark's moral framework, as it is developed across the show, is broadly deontological. Mark believes that there are things you do not do, regardless of the consequences. Mark believes that killing, in particular, is something you do not do except in the most extreme circumstances, and that the prohibition is not just instrumental but constitutive. The prohibition is part of what makes him Mark. The prohibition is what separates him from his father. The prohibition is the line he draws between himself and the Viltrumite tradition he is otherwise indistinguishable from. Oliver's moral framework is broadly consequentialist. Oliver believes that you do whatever produces the best outcome, and that the prohibition against killing, like any other prohibition, has to be weighed against the consequences of refusing to kill. Oliver does not consider this a controversial position. Oliver considers it the only rational position. When Mark argues with him about it, Oliver listens, and then Oliver continues to act on his own framework, because Oliver does not see Mark's framework as obviously correct. Oliver sees Mark's framework as one option among several, and Oliver has chosen the option that produces, in his calculation, the best outcomes for the people he loves. The theory says that Oliver is not in this disagreement the immature one. Oliver is, in some ways, the more philosophically sophisticated one. He has thought through the question, and he has arrived at a position, and he is acting on the position with internal consistency. The fact that the show frames Mark as the moral center and Oliver as the deviation is, in the theory, an artifact of the show's own ethical commitments rather than a verdict on which framework is actually correct. The show prefers Mark's framework because the show is invested in Mark as a hero, and a hero in a story like this, one has to maintain the prohibition for the story to work. But the show is not in fact telling you that Oliver is wrong. The show is telling you that Oliver has chosen differently, and that the difference matters, and that the difference will continue to matter as Oliver grows up. This is the part of the theory that the show has been quietly developing for several seasons. Oliver is not a villain. Oliver is not even a moral failure. Oliver is an alternative, and the alternative has its own logic. And the alternative is going to grow into a being whose ethical position the universe will eventually have to take seriously. Mark cannot dismiss him. Mark cannot reform him. Mark can only love him and let him develop, and trust that the love itself is part of what will shape the kind of being Oliver becomes, even if the framework Oliver operates by remains different from Mark's. The theory has a sharper extension. The sharper extension says that Oliver, in the long run, may be the necessary complement to Mark's leadership of the post-Viltrum Order. Mark, as ruler of what the Empire becomes, will need to make decisions that his own framework cannot make. Mark will need someone in the inner circle who can do the calculations Mark cannot bring himself to do. Mark will need a kind of consequentialist counterweight to his own deontology, because pure deontology, applied to the governance of a multi-planet empire, will produce paralysis in cases where action is required. Oliver is, in this reading, the future second-in-command. Oliver is the one who will do the hard math when Mark cannot, and who will, by doing it, allow Mark to remain the kind of leader Mark needs to be. This is a difficult conclusion for the show to commit to, because it would mean accepting that the universe at some level requires a division of moral labor between beings who can hold the line and beings who can cross it. The show prefers, in its surface presentation, the cleaner story of a single hero who can do everything. The theory says the clean story is unsustainable, and the show, in its quieter moments, knows it. Oliver is being set up, slowly, to be the answer to a question Mark has not yet fully asked. You can see the setup if you look. You can see it in the moments when Oliver makes a tactical decision in a fight that Mark would not have made, and the decision works, and Mark, after the fight, has to sit with the fact that his framework would have produced a worse outcome. You can see it in the moments when Oliver argues for a course of action that Mark refuses, and the universe, by the next episode, has demonstrated that Oliver's course was the correct one. You can see it in the moments when Oliver, very young, sometimes within the same episode in which he was a small child, says something that the older Mark cannot answer. The compression of Oliver's development has produced, by accident or by design, a being whose intelligence has outstripped his social experience, and whose conclusions are therefore unfiltered by the social pressures that would have caused a human-paced child to second-guess them. Oliver, in this reading, is the show's experiment with a different kind of person, a person who has not been allowed the long developmental window in which conventional human ethics congeal. A person who has had to construct his ethics from scratch in a few years while his body was racing past his philosophy. A person whose ethics are therefore, in some ways, more honest than Mark's, because they have been built without the cushioning that ordinary development provides. The theory closes with the observation that Oliver's existence is, in the long view of the show, an asset rather than a problem. The universe needs Oliver. The universe needs a being who can carry the part of the moral load that Mark cannot. The universe is not going to be governed well by a single framework. The universe is going to be governed well, if at all, by a partnership between frameworks, and Oliver is the other half of that partnership. The show is letting Oliver grow up in real time, so that when the partnership becomes operational, you will already understand why it is necessary. When you watch Oliver now, with this theory in mind, the disagreements with Mark stop feeling like adolescent rebellion. They start feeling like the early sessions of a long-running governing council in which two beings are working out in advance how they are going to divide the work that the universe is about to dump on them. The arguments are practice. The arguments are training. The arguments are how the two of them are going to learn to work together at the scale the future will require. Oliver is not a problem to be solved. Oliver is a partner to be developed. The show, in its quietest moments, is showing you that this is true. The 11th theory is about the being on the far side of all of this, who has been planning at a scale none of the heroes have yet been forced to perceive, and whose final calculation will eventually require Mark to confront a kind of antagonist the show has not previously attempted. The 11th theory is about Thrag, the Grand Regent of the Viltrumite Empire, and about the slow generational project that Thrag has been running on the side of the war that no one outside the highest levels of Viltrumite command knows is happening. The project is hybridization. Thrag understands, more clearly than any other Viltrumite, that the Empire is in demographic crisis. The Viltrumites are immortal, but they are not infinitely reproducing. Births are rare. Compatible partners are rare. The population, which was already small by galactic standards, has been steadily declining for centuries, because the species is too combat-oriented and too long-lived to maintain the reproductive activity that would replenish its numbers. Thrag has been watching this decline for his entire term as Grand Regent, and Thrag has concluded, with the cold patience that defines him, that the Empire cannot survive on its existing population alone. The Empire needs new Viltrumites. The Empire cannot produce them at the rate required. Therefore, the Empire must produce them by interbreeding with compatible species across the galaxy. The interbreeding program is, in the comic, a major plot revelation. Thrag has been quietly placing Viltrumite agents on worlds with genetically compatible populations, instructing them to produce children with the local populations, and arranging for the children to be collected and raised in Viltrumite-controlled facilities once they manifest sufficient power. The children, when raised correctly, are Viltrumite in everything but the precise percentage of their genetic heritage. They are loyal, they are trained, they are, in many cases, more powerful than full-blooded Viltrumites of the previous generation. Because hybrid vigor combined with selective breeding has produced a generation of warriors who exceed the median for the species. The program is the future of the Empire. Thrag knows this. The other Viltrumites who consider hybridization an abomination according to the Empire's official ideology do not know about the program at all, or know only the cover story. Thrag has been running it for centuries, in secret, against the official ideology of his own species, because Thrag has done the math and concluded that ideological purity is incompatible with species survival, and that survival has to take precedence over purity if the Empire is to mean anything in the long run. This is what Thrag actually thinks. This is what Thrag is doing while the rest of the Empire is fighting wars on the official agenda. Thrag is, in his own private accounting, the only Viltrumite who is taking the long view, and he is willing to be hated by his own species, eventually, for the choices he has made on their behalf. The theory says that Thrag's program is the dark mirror of the Grayson story. Nolan accidentally produced a hybrid child by falling in love. Thrag is producing hybrid children by policy. The Grayson child became Mark, who refused the Empire's ideology and developed an alternative. The Thrag children are being raised to embrace the Empire's ideology and to be more loyal to it than any full Viltrumite. The two projects, Nolan's accidental one and Thrag's intentional one, are competing across generations for the future of what a hybrid Viltrumite can be. This is the framing that gives Mark's eventual ascension its full weight. Mark is not just inheriting the Empire because the population has been reduced. Mark is inheriting the Empire in the middle of a long-running internal struggle between two visions of what the species is going to become. Thrag's vision is the Empire as a hybrid majority loyal to the old conquest ideology. Mark's vision, which he has not yet fully articulated even to himself, Is the Empire as a hybrid majority loyal to a different ideology entirely, one closer to what Nolan eventually developed on Earth? The two visions are incompatible. The two visions are going to fight, in the long run, for the soul of the Empire, and the fight is going to use the children of the hybridization program as its primary battleground. The theory has a sharper extension. The sharper extension says that Thrag's hybrid children, when they reach maturity, will be the most consequential demographic in the galaxy. They will outnumber the full Viltrumites. They will be more powerful individually than most members of the previous generation. They will be ideologically committed to whatever ideology they were raised with. If Thrag has raised them well, they will be loyal soldiers of an empire that has internalized the conquest doctrine more deeply than any previous generation. If Mark, after the fall of Thrag, can reach them in time, they can be re-educated, partially, and brought into a different vision of what the species can be. The fight for the hybrid generation is the fight for the next 1,000 years of galactic history. The fight is not in the conventional sense a fight between heroes and villains. The fight is a fight between two long-term educational programs, one of which has had centuries to develop and one of which has had decades. Mark, when he takes the throne, will be operating from behind. The Thrag children will already be partially raised. Mark will have to do the work of re-educating them while simultaneously administering the Empire and managing the Coalition's relationship with the post-Viltrum Order. The work is not glamorous. The work is governance. The work will consume the rest of Mark's life. The theory says this is what Mark's adulthood actually is. Mark is not in the long run a fighter. Mark is, in the long run, an administrator and an educator, and a head of state. The fighting was the apprenticeship. The governing is the job. The show has been preparing you for this transition by slowly de-emphasizing the fights and slowly increasing the time Mark spends thinking, deciding, and negotiating. The show is telling you, in its later arcs, that the action genre Mark started in is not the genre he is going to end in. He is going to end in a political drama, and the political drama is going to be about whether he can outmaneuver Thrag's inheritance without losing his own soul. The theory closes with the observation that Thrag, despite being the show's most consequential long-term antagonist, is not quite a villain in the conventional sense. Thrag is doing what he believes the species requires. The species requires hybridization. The species, in some sense, is grateful. Even if individual members would consider Thrag's methods abhorrent, the species would not survive without him. Thrag, in this reading, is the necessary monster the species produces in order to live. Mark, after Thrag, will have to either become a different kind of necessary monster, or invent a different kind of leadership that does not require the monstrousness Thrag embodied. The invention is the work of Mark's reign. The reign is the show's hidden subject. The reign is where the story is actually going. You will not see most of it. The show, even in its longest seasons, can only show you the prelude. The prelude is the part where Mark learns who he is, what he can do, what he is willing to do, and what the alternative would cost him. The reign itself is implied. The reign is what the audience is being prepared slowly to imagine. And the imagination, by the end, is the gift the show is trying to give you. The imagination is the picture of a hybrid king ruling a hybrid empire across a galaxy in slow recovery from millennia of conquest, with a wife who can rearrange matter at the atomic level, with a brother who carries the consequentialist load his deontology cannot, with a daughter who will be more powerful than any of them and who will inherit, in time, whatever Mark and Eve managed to build. The imagination is the picture of a project that started on a small blue planet, with a man writing children's books about steam trains, who failed his mission, who smiled before he flew away, and whose smile turned out to be the seed of everything that came after. There are smaller theories that orbit the larger ones, and that deserve a quiet pass before the night ends, because they fill in the corners of the picture in ways that the major theories do not have time to address. The first of these smaller theories is about the immortal, who is, in the show's eventual confirmation, Abraham Lincoln, or at least a being who once was Abraham Lincoln before his death and assassination became a piece of his much longer biography. The immortal has lived for at least several thousand years before his Lincoln period, and several centuries after it, and the theory is about what that kind of duration does to a mind that was not designed to sustain it. The theory says that the immortal is not, by the time you meet him, a single coherent person. The immortal is a sequence of personas that a single body has worn across millennia, with each persona retaining only fragmentary memories of the one before it, and with the current persona having developed largely as a defense against the cumulative weight of the memories he cannot quite suppress. He acts, in the show, like a man who has been pretending to be a soldier for several lifetimes, because the pretense is easier than the alternative, and the alternative would be to sit with the fact that he has outlived every person he has ever loved, several times over, and that the universe has never given him a way to grieve at the scale his life requires. The pretense of being a soldier provides a structure. The structure provides a reason to keep moving. The movement is what keeps the grief from arriving in a single overwhelming wave that the body could not survive. You can see this in his behavior. He throws himself into fights with a willingness that does not quite read as bravery, because bravery implies the possibility of fear, and the immortal has long since stopped being afraid of anything physical. What he is afraid of is silence. What he is afraid of is the time between fights, when there is nothing to do but think. He volunteers for missions other heroes would refuse. He stays at the front of every confrontation not because he is the strongest, but because being at the front guarantees that he will not have to be alone with his own thoughts for the duration of the engagement. When Nolan kills him in the original Guardians massacre, what dies is not the immortal's body. The body recovers. What dies is the particular persona the immortal had been wearing for the previous century. The one that had allowed him to function as a member of a team, the one that had allowed him to trust other beings, the one that had allowed him a relationship with Duplicate that gave him the closest thing to ordinary human happiness he had experienced in several hundred years. When the body wakes up, the persona is gone, and what replaces it is rage. The rage is, in this theory, not a rage at Nolan in particular. The rage is the rage at being yanked, again, out of a brief stable period and forced to construct a new persona from scratch. And the rage is being directed at Nolan, because Nolan is the convenient target. And because rage requires a target, and because the immortal has had enough centuries of practice in directing rage at convenient targets to do it almost automatically. The theory says that the immortal's arc across the show is the arc of a being slowly remembering that the construction of a new persona is possible. He does, in time, build something with Duplicate. He does, in time, become a father. He does, in time, allow himself to risk attachment again, knowing what attachment is going to cost him when the people he attaches to die in a fraction of his lifespan. The willingness to risk it is the only kind of bravery the immortal has left. The willingness to risk it is what makes him, despite everything, a hero in the senses that still apply to a being of his age. The smaller second of these smaller theories is about a detective who left, and about what he saw before he went. Damien Darkblood, the demon detective, was introduced as a recurring presence in the show's first season, investigating the Guardians massacre with a thoroughness that the human authorities lacked the cosmic perspective to match. Darkblood very early concluded that Nolan had committed the murders. He was right. He was also dismissed by Cecil, who knew Darkblood was right, but who could not let the conclusion become public knowledge for operational reasons. Darkblood left Earth, eventually, with his investigation officially incomplete, and he has not, in the show's main timeline, returned. The theory is about why he left so quietly, given what he knew. The theory says that Darkblood did not leave because he had failed. Darkblood left because he had succeeded, and because the success had taught him something about the cosmic order that his profession had not prepared him to address. The theory says that Darkblood, in the course of his investigation, became aware of the Coalition's broader concerns about the Viltrumites, became aware of Mark's hybrid status, became aware of the long-term project that Cecil and the Coalition and several other parties were quietly running in parallel, and concluded that his role as a small-scale moral investigator was incompatible with the scale of the actual moral question the universe was facing. Demons, in the show's metaphysics, are bound by certain rules about the kinds of moral questions they can adjudicate. They can investigate individual crimes, they can identify perpetrators, they can deliver verdicts. They are not equipped to adjudicate questions about whether a species should be allowed to continue, whether an empire should be allowed to govern, whether a planet should be sacrificed to save a galaxy. These are not crimes. These are policy decisions. The vocabulary of demonic justice does not contain the necessary terms. Darkblood, in the theory, recognized this. He recognized that the case he had been working was, in a larger sense, the wrong kind of case. He recognized that the moral architecture of the universe Mark was about to inherit could not be policed by detectives. He left Earth not in defeat, but in a kind of philosophical retirement, having understood that his profession had nothing further to offer this particular story. He went somewhere else. He took other cases. He probably continued to be useful in smaller theaters where the moral questions were of a scale his vocabulary could still address. He has not come back because there is nothing for him to come back to. The case is closed in the only sense that can ever close it, which is that the case has become too large for his methods. The theory closes with the observation that the absence of Darkblood in the later seasons of the show is itself a kind of statement. The show is telling you that the moral framework you are operating inside, by the time the Viltrumite War becomes the dominant plot, is not the framework that any small-scale moral authority can adjudicate. There is no court that can try Thrag. There is no demon who can punish Cecil. There is no procedure for evaluating whether Mark's eventual decisions as ruler will be just. The moral order has scaled up, and the only beings competent to participate in the new moral order are the beings who are themselves at the new scale. Mark, Eve, Alan, Thrag. They are their own court. The show, by removing Darkblood, has been telling you that they have to be. The third of these smaller theories is about a being who has, in some ways, the cleanest philosophical project in the entire show. The theory is about Battle Beast, and about why his pursuit of a worthy opponent is not as it first appears. A meathead's quest for combat satisfaction, but something closer to a religious project conducted in a vocabulary that the rest of the show does not speak. Battle Beast comes from a species and a culture in which physical combat is the primary form of meaning-making. This is not an unusual cultural arrangement in the galaxy of the show. Several species treat combat as the central activity around which meaning is constructed, and the Viltrumites are themselves the most extreme example of this tendency. Battle Beast, however, takes the project further than any other being you encounter. For him, combat is not just a way of testing yourself. Combat is the only way of testing yourself, and the test is the means by which a being discovers whether his life has been worth living. A being who has never been pushed to his limits cannot know what his limits are. A being who does not know his limits cannot know himself. Therefore, self-knowledge requires the encounter with an opponent who can push you to a limit you have never reached. Battle Beast spends his life searching for such an opponent. He fights everyone. He defeats almost everyone. He is, in his own private accounting, miserable, because every fight he wins is a fight that has failed to teach him anything about himself, and he is running out of being strong enough to teach him anything. He is, in this reading, a being trapped at the top of his own ladder, looking up at a ceiling no one has ever reached above, and trying to find a way to break through it. He is lonely. The loneliness is the loneliness of the only practitioner of a discipline who has run out of teachers. The theory says that Battle Beast's search is, in religious terms, a search for transcendence. He is trying to encounter the divine through combat. He is trying to find the opponent who will, in defeating him, finally show him what he is. He is, in his own way, as much a seeker as any monk in any monastery. The vocabulary is different. The structure is the same. He wants to meet his maker. He has decided that the only way to meet his maker is in the arena. Thrag, eventually, is what Battle Beast finds. The fight between them is the answer to the question Battle Beast has been asking his entire life. The answer, in the comic, is that yes, there is an opponent strong enough to defeat him, and yes, the opponent will defeat him, and yes, the defeat is the transcendence he has been seeking. Battle Beast dies. In that fight, with what the comic strongly implies is a kind of satisfaction the rest of his life had been unable to produce. He has found the limit. He has met the ceiling. The encounter has shown him what he is, by showing him what he is not. The death is not tragic, in his own framework. The death is the completion of a project he had been working on for his entire life. The theory closes with the observation that Battle Beast is the show's quietest commentary on the question of meaning. The show contains characters who construct meaning through love. The show contains characters who construct meaning through duty. The show contains characters who construct meaning through power. Battle Beast constructs meaning through combat, and the construction is, in his own terms, internally consistent. He is not a villain, even when he is fighting on the wrong side of a given engagement. He is a being whose framework happens to require what his framework requires, and who is honest about it in a way that very few other beings in the show are honest about their own frameworks. He is, in his own way, the only character who fully understands what he is doing, because he is the only character whose framework is so simple that there is nothing to misunderstand. You can read Mark in the long run as a being whose framework will never be that simple. Mark is going to spend his life carrying frameworks that contradict each other. Mark is going to spend his life being a hybrid in more ways than the genetic one. Battle Beast, by contrast, will always be one thing, all the way down. The show contrasts them when it puts them in scenes together, and the contrast is not flattering to either of them. Mark is more humane. Battle Beast is more coherent. Neither one of them is on his own, the answer. The answer, if there is one, is some combination of their two approaches, and the show is not, in its run, particularly interested in spelling out what that combination would look like. The show is interested in showing you the two extremes, and trusting you to do the synthesis yourself in the long night between watching one episode and the next. There are other theories. There are theories about the Reanimen and about whether D.A. Sinclair's research, even after his arrest, has been continued by other parties under different names. There are theories about the Lizard League and the various other small-time villains who turn out, over time, to be funded by larger interests for purposes the small-time villains do not understand. There are theories about the sequids, and about whether their hive mind structure represents a glimpse of the kind of consciousness Viltrumite-style individualism is going to have to learn to coexist with eventually. There are theories about Black Samson and his lost powers, about the Order and their connection to the Viltrumite Empire, about Monster Girl's curse and what happens when she finally reaches the moment in her aging cycle that she has been counting towards since she was a child. The show is full of theories. The show is, in many ways, the kind of show that produces theories the way a fertile garden produces volunteer seedlings, in places the gardener did not plant them. You do not have to engage with all of them. The major theories, the ones we have walked through tonight, are the load-bearing ones. They are the ones that, once you see them, allow the rest of the show to make a kind of sense it did not make before. They are the ones that explain why Mark is what he is, why the people around him are what they are, and where the story is, in the long run, going. The smaller theories are decorative. They are the ornaments hanging from the load-bearing beams. They are beautiful. They are not by themselves structural. The structure, taken as a whole, is the picture of a coming-of-age story whose ending is a coronation. The structure is the picture of a hybrid boy on a small planet being slowly prepared by every party with an interest in the outcome to take a throne he does not yet know exists. The structure is the picture of a war that the universe has been losing for a very long time, and that is finally, in this generation, about to be won, not because the heroes have invented a new weapon, but because the heroes have produced a new kind of leader, and the new kind of leader is going to do what the old kind never could. The new kind of leader is going to govern, and the governing, when it begins, is going to be the part of the story you will have to imagine for yourself. The show, even at its longest, can only show you the prelude. The rain is implied. The rain is the silence after the credits roll. The rain is the part you carry with you into the dark. When the screen goes off, and you lie there in the bed thinking about a boy who did not know what he was being prepared for, and who turned out to be exactly the being the universe needed, which is, in some sense, the only kind of story that ends well. There is a final theory, and it is the theory that ties the smaller ones together into a shape, and it is the theory about Monster Girl, who is sometimes called Amanda, and whose entire arc is the show's most concentrated meditation on what it costs to be born into a body that does not obey you. Monster Girl's curse in the show's framing is straightforward. Every time she transforms into her monster form, her human form ages backward by some amount. She started in some past she does not always discuss as an adult. She has been getting younger by small increments every time she has used her power. By the time you meet her in the show, she is in the body of a young teenager. By the time the events of the later seasons unfold, she is in the body of someone younger still. The trajectory is clear. The trajectory is also not, strictly speaking, a death sentence, because the body does not die at the lower bound. The body simply continues to grow younger until it reaches a point at which the consciousness inside it can no longer be sustained by the underdeveloped brain of an infant, and at that point the consciousness, in some sense the show is never fully spelled out, ends. Not by death, by dilution. The theory says that Monster Girl is, in this respect, the show's most precise model of a question the show is too polite to ask in a larger arc. The question is whether the body is part of the self, and what happens to the self when the body is forcibly altered beyond a certain threshold. Eve, in her own arc, is going to face this question voluntarily by rebuilding her own body to extend her lifespan. Rudy faced this question voluntarily by transferring his consciousness into a cloned body. Marky, in the future, will face this question structurally by being born into a body that exceeds the bodies of her parents. Monster Girl is facing this question without having chosen it. Monster Girl is the only character in the show whose body is changing against her will, on a schedule she did not set, toward an endpoint she did not consent to. This makes her, in the theory, the show's quietest tragic figure. She is not killed in a fight. She is not betrayed by an institution. She is not destroyed by an enemy. She is simply, slowly being unmade by her own power, and the only way to stop the unmaking is to refuse to use the power at all, and the refusal is not, in her circumstances, available. She is a hero. The institution she works for needs her power. The world she protects needs her power. She uses the power because the alternative is the loss of the things she cares about. And every time she uses the power she loses, irrevocably, some amount of the future she could have had as a person rather than as a hero. The theory has a darker extension. The darker extension is about the relationship between Monster Girl and the Immortal. The two of them, by the show's later arcs, are in a relationship that the show treats with surprising tenderness. The relationship is, on its face, deeply strange. The Immortal is functionally ageless and looks like an adult man. Monster Girl is in a body that is rapidly becoming younger and that is, by the standards of the world around them, the body of a child. The show, to its credit, does not look away from the strangeness. The show acknowledges that the two of them are constantly negotiating, in private, what the relationship is allowed to be, what the body is and is not appropriate for, and how the two of them are going to manage the fact that the trajectory of her body is heading in a direction that will make the relationship eventually untenable in any conventional form. The theory says that the relationship is the show's quiet attempt to model what it would mean to love a person whose substrate is unstable. The immortal cannot love her body, because her body is not in any reliable sense hers. The immortal has to love the consciousness inside the body, and the consciousness has to trust that the immortal can keep loving it as the body it occupies changes around it. The relationship is, in this reading, the show's most explicit endorsement of the position that the self is not the body, that the self is something the body carries, and that love between selves can survive the alteration of the bodies that contain them. The relationship is not in the show a comfortable one. It is not in the show presented as a romance in the conventional sense. It is presented as a problem. Two beings are working on together, and the problem is the problem of how to love a person whose physical situation makes love, in any form your culture has prepared you for, impossible. The two of them are working out a new form. The new form will, by necessity, not survive the eventual endpoint of Monster Girl's curse. But the working on it in the meantime is what gives both of their arcs the quiet pulse of meaning that runs underneath the larger battles. The theory closes with the observation that Monster Girl is, in this reading, the show's most direct rebuke to the idea that power is good. Monster Girl's power is what is killing her, slowly in installments. The power is useful. The power is necessary. The power is also, in her own private accounting, a kind of theft from her own future. Every transformation is a withdrawal from an account she did not know she had until she started drawing on it. And the account has a bottom, and the bottom is approaching at a rate she cannot easily slow. She lives every day with the knowledge that the work she does is the work that is unmaking her. You can read every other character in the show through Monster Girl's frame. Mark, in his fights, accumulates physical and psychological wounds that he will eventually have to reckon with. Eve, in her uses of her power, accelerates her own physical evolution in ways that may have consequences she has not yet recognized. Cecil, in every operational decision, accumulates moral damage that the wire in his head is only partially able to manage. The immortal, in every persona, leaves behind a previous self that he cannot fully recover. Every character is in some way paying for the work they do with installments of the future they could otherwise have had. Monster Girl is the only one who is paying it visibly, on screen, in the form of a body that is regressing toward an endpoint none of them want to think about. She is the show's reminder that all of them are paying. She is the show's reminder that the calculations the heroes make about cost are real, that the heroes are not, despite the surface invincibility implied by the title, actually invincible, and that the price they will eventually pay for the lives they have lived is a price the universe will, in time, collect. When you watch her now with this theory in mind, the moments of her on screen become almost unbearable. She is the only character in the show who does not have a way out. Mark can refuse the throne, Eve can choose not to extend her lifespan, Cecil can resign, Rudy can attempt to reverse the transfer, the Immortal can construct another persona, Monster Girl has no equivalent escape. The curse is the curse. The trajectory is the trajectory. The only choice she has is whether to use the power that is unmaking her, and refusing to use it would be its own kind of unmaking, because the refusal would leave the people she loves to die in fights she could have won for them. She uses the power. She continues to use it. The using is, in its own way, the most honest expression of love that the show contains. She is, in every transformation, choosing other people over her own future. She is, in every transformation, paying for their survival in installments of her own. She's doing this without being asked to do it, without expecting anyone to thank her for it, and without, in most cases, even fully acknowledging to herself that this is what she is doing. She is the show's quietest saint. The show, very wisely, does not make a fuss about her sanctity. The show only lets her be what she is, and trusts you to notice. You may not have noticed. Most viewers do not. The show buries her arc underneath the louder arcs of the more famous characters. The show lets her work in the background, lets her transformations be brief, lets her relationship with the Immortal develop in the gaps between the major fights. The show is, in this respect, perhaps too discreet for its own good. The show is, in this respect, perhaps doing exactly what Monster Girl herself would do, which is to make sure that her costs are absorbed quietly without disrupting the larger work, because the disruption would not be useful to anyone. The theory closes by noting that Monster Girl is, in this reading, the show's hidden moral center. Mark is the show's most powerful character. Cecil is the show's most consequential decision-maker. Monster Girl is the show's most morally precise figure, because she is the only one whose moral situation is so stark that the only ethical analysis required is whether she is willing to keep paying the cost she has been paying. And the answer is yes. And the answer is yes again. And the answer is yes for as long as the body holds together. She is, in this reading, what every other character is trying to be, without quite knowing it. She is the demonstration that the work is worth doing, even when the work is unmaking the worker. She is the demonstration that the love is worth giving, even when the love is going to outlive the body that gives it. She is the demonstration that the universe is, in the end, only as good as the beings who are willing to keep paying for it, and that the bill is real, and that the bill is being paid right now by beings whose costs are invisible to almost everyone, including, sometimes, themselves. When the show ends, however it ends, Monster Girl will probably not be the character the audience remembers most clearly. Mark will be. Eve will be. The famous fights will be. But the structure of the show taken as a whole will not work without her. She is the load-bearing reminder of cost. She is the load-bearing reminder that everything in this story has a price, and that the price is paid by someone, and that someone is sometimes the smallest figure in the room, doing the quietest work, in a body that is running out of time at a rate no one else can see. That is the last of the major theories. There are, as noted, others. There will, given the show's continuing production, be still others by the time you wake up tomorrow. The theories will multiply. The theories will evolve. The theories will be argued about in long threads on the internet by people who care about this story more than is, strictly speaking, reasonable. That is the nature of a show like this one. It produces theories the way a fertile field produces seedlings. It does so because it is built carefully enough that the careful viewing rewards itself. And because the writers have, with admirable patience, refused to over-explain, and because the silences in the show are exactly large enough to hold the questions the audience needs to keep asking, you have walked through many of them tonight. You have walked through them slowly, because the night is the right time to walk through them. You have walked through them in the order that, looking back, you can see was always the right order. Nolan first, because everything begins with the father. Mark second, because everything ends with the son. Cecil third, because the institutional context shapes both of them more than either of them admits. Conquest fourth, because the test is what reveals the student. Alan fifth, because the war has been engineering champions on every side. Rudy sixth, because the question of identity is going to dominate the next century of the universe's moral life. The Maulers seventh, because they are the prototype. Eve eighth, because she is the warning. Oliver 10th, because he is the partner. Thrag 11th, because he is the antagonist whose project is the future. The smaller theories at the end, because the corners of the picture need their own attention, and because the universe is full of beings whose stories deserve at least a paragraph, even when the paragraph is the last paragraph of a long night. There is a scene in the final episode of the first season of Invincible where a father beats his son nearly unconscious across 3 continents while asking the same question over and over. What will you have, Mark, when everyone you know is dead? The boy answers him from the floor of a city he has helped destroy. The answer is not a speech. The answer is 2 soft words about who would still be there at the end of all that grief. You know now what those words were doing? They were not just a son comforting a father. They were not just a boy refusing to be broken. They were the first move in a much longer game in which a hybrid Viltrumite would slowly become the only being in the universe positioned to take the throne his species had built and turn it into something else. The 2 words were a thesis. The 2 words were a manifesto. The 2 words were the seed of every later decision the boy would make, the marriage he would enter, the brother he would raise, the empire he would inherit, and the daughter he would, in time, hold in his arms and try to figure out how to teach to be merciful in a body that has no need of mercy. You, Dad, I'd still have you. Those words explained Nolan's smile, because Nolan understood, in the second they were spoken, that the project he had been running on Earth had succeeded. He had not raised a soldier. He had raised a son. The son, in time, would do what no soldier ever could. The son would, in time, govern. The son would do it by remembering who had stood with him on the floor of a city in the worst moment of his early life. The son would do it by extending that same standing with to other beings, across other crises, until the standing with had become the entire foundation of a new kind of cosmic order. The whole show is the slow unfolding of that one answer. Every theory you have heard tonight is a small piece of the unfolding. The theories about Cecil and Eve and Alan and Conquest and the Maulers and Rudy and Angstrom and Oliver and Thrag, are all, in their way, the same theory. The theory is that a universe can be governed by a being who remembers the people who stood with him, and that the remembering is the only force in the universe strong enough to interrupt the cycle of conquest that has run for thousands of years before he was born. The interruption is the project. The boy on the floor is the project's first day. The throne, in the distance, is the project's last. Everything in between is the long work of becoming the kind of being who can carry the weight of both the floor and the throne without forgetting that they are, in some way, the same thing. The throne is only the floor, raised higher. The standing width is the same. If you found something worth carrying away from this, subscribing helps more than you would think. Thank you for staying. Sleep well. I will see you in the next one.